right, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shlomi Dinar, and I'm Associate Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs. On behalf of the Green School, I want to welcome you to our event this morning. Thank you for those joining us in person, and of course, thank you to those of you who are joining us via Zoom. I also want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors of today's event, as well as recognize a few individuals. The Dorothea Green Lecture Series, the European and Eurasian Studies Program, the Master of Arts in Global Affairs Program. Let me now thank a few individuals to include Pedro Bota, Jeanette Garcia Montez, Dana Fernandez, Alice Milagre, Melissa Burgess, Aragorn Vitali, and Malena Torres. I want to thank you for your assistance in making this event happen. And of course, I also want to thank the Graham Center team for their assistance with the setup of the room and of course, the Zoom session. Before I formally introduce our very special guest this morning, who I will have the honor of having a discussion on a very, very important and timely topic, I want to take a few minutes to say a few words about the Master of Arts in Global Affairs program, which is also one of the co-sponsors of this event. We have quite a few students in the audience, as well as through Zoom, as well as other individuals who may be interested in or are thinking about graduate school. And I want to encourage all of you to go to our website, the program's website, maga.fiu.edu. Let me say that again, maga.fiu.edu. Explore the program, explore the various tracks and courses offered, explore the top faculty teaching in the program, and the many other fantastic features and services the program offers. So if you're interested in a career in the broad field of global affairs, to include intelligence and security, development, or cybersecurity, among other topics, and if you're interested in a career in the governmental, non-governmental, or private sectors, do check out the Global Affairs program. I will leave you with this impressive statistic. More than 90% of global affairs students secure a job before or around graduation. Oh yes, and one more thing that I want to tell you. For those of you in attendance today, whether in person or via Zoom, if you do plan to apply, we're waiving the application fee for the fall 2022 application cycle. So I hope you all, again, will visit the website, maga.fiu.edu, or email maga@fiu.edu for more information about applying. Let me now turn to today's discussion and our special guest. Throughout the past few weeks, the Green School has featured several lectures and conversations on the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of a sovereign country. Today, we build on those previous events, but attempt to consider the broader geopolitical implications of the war. For this discussion, we are joined by a true expert on the topic, David Kramer. Many of you know David Kramer, who, while still a senior fellow in the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs, is now the Bradford M. Freeman Managing Director for Global Policy at the George W. Bush Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, he taught at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs, where he was also the director of the European and Eurasian Studies program. Before moving to Miami, Kramer worked in Washington, D.C. for 24 years, including as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy with the McCain Institute for International Leadership, President of Freedom House, and Senior Transatlantic Marshall Fund of the United States. Kramer also served 8 years in the U.S. Department of State during the George W. Bush administration, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus affairs, as well as regional non-proliferation issues, professional staff member in the Secretary's Office of Policy Planning, and senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. He was also Executive Director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy in Washington. He is author of the book, Back to Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime. Kramer chairs the board of the Free Russia Foundation and serves on the board of the International Republican Institute. He also serves as a member of the Advisory Council for the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, for Refugees International, for Foreign Policy for America, and is a contributing editor to The American Purpose. A native of Massachusetts, Kramer received his MA in Soviet Studies from Harvard University and his BA in Soviet Studies and Political Science from Tufts University. Please join me in welcoming David Kramer. So this is going to be what we like to call a Davos-style discussion, where I will be posing a variety of questions for David Kramer, and we'll have a conversation. Of course, we have a fantastic audience here in person, and of course, we have an audience over Zoom. So what I always like to do when we have these Davos-style conversations is I'll start off with one or two questions in this case, David Kramer, but I would very much welcome questions from the audience. Feel free to just raise your hand. And of course, questions from the audience on Zoom. We have someone here who's helping us field those questions from those on Zoom. I, of course, can see those who are raising their hands in the room. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand or offer a question in the chat over Zoom. So I'd like to start with kind of our first question for today, and that is, with the Russian invasion taking place on February 24th, we're now about 2 months into the war. Could you please give us a brief recap of where we are today in terms of this war as it relates to both the Ukrainian and also the Russian sides?
Sure. Well, Swami, first, thanks very much for having me and for inviting me to do this. It's great to be back here because I left Miami 3.5 weeks ago to move to Dallas, where I am now located working at the Bush Institute. But I did have the great fortune to work with so many wonderful friends here and to teach in the master's program that you oversee. And just to reinforce what you were saying, I've encountered some terrific students in this program. It offers a great education. It prepares students extraordinarily well for either a career in government and the non-governmental sector, the private sector, or pursuing a PhD if that's what students want to do. So I can't speak highly enough about the master's program here, and kudos to you and everyone involved in it, Aragon, Milena, and everyone. Um, the situation in Ukraine is pretty extraordinary because it has not gone according to how most analysts predicted it would. There was huge underestimation of the Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves, to defend their freedom, to defend their country, to defend their land. And under President Zelensky's leadership, which has been absolutely stellar, in this case, having a former actor step into the role as president to play the role of a wartime president has worked brilliantly. And he has, I think, performed as well as anyone possibly could under extraordinary circumstances, knowing that President Putin was out for him, wanted to kill him, wanted to literally decapitate the Ukrainian government, and to have led the resistance, the pushback, a military campaign that has impressed everyone, I think, and Ukrainian citizens, both military and civilians, deserve enormous credit for what they have done at enormous loss of life. We've all seen these gruesome, barbaric pictures and images coming from places like Bucha and Mariupol and others. And this is the price Ukrainians are paying to defend their land from a wholly unprovoked and unjustified invasion launched by one person, and that is Vladimir Putin. So I talked about the underestimation on the Ukrainian side. There was also a huge overestimation of Russian military capabilities. And this is reflected in part by a military that has really not been treated well over the years, where the view and attitude is that they are dispensable. They can be replaced at a moment's notice. They were sent on a mission for which they have no clear understanding why. We've got to remember that Putin last July wrote a nearly 7,000 word treatise or screed published on the Kremlin website in which he talked about Ukrainians and Russians being one people. And so if they're one people, then Russian forces on the ground must wonder, why are we attacking one people? And so the lack of a real clearly identifiable mission, a justification for this attack, for the invasion, the fact that Russian forces were so wholly undersupplied and unprepared for the mission they encountered. Putin and the military, Russian military, expected that they would be welcomed, embraced with open arms by Ukrainians, viewed as liberators. After all, in the lead up to this, the Russian propaganda was describing the Ukrainian leadership and much of the population as a bunch of Nazis, which is absurd on its face, but particularly given that the president of Ukraine, who won the election in 2019 with 72% of the vote, is Jewish, had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust. There has been in the past, not currently, a Jewish prime minister in Ukraine. Ukraine, despite a pretty checkered history when it came to anti Semitism, is now viewed as one of the least anti Semitic countries in Europe, which is a major accomplishment. So, this whole effort to try to portray Ukrainian leadership as a bunch of Nazis, wholly unfounded, ridiculous. But then, if you're describing them as one people and also, on the other hand, describing them as Nazis, the justification for this campaign really doesn't hold up. And so, the Russian forces have been grossly undersupplied. They have encountered more resistance than they ever anticipated. And their objective was to take Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, in the north central part of the country. And they failed spectacularly. And now Putin has and the military have repositioned their forces to the south and the east, and inflicting terrible harm on civilian populations. We may never know the real total number of casualties here, but in Mariupol, the mayor has estimated that more than 10,000 civilians have been killed. And we have seen a campaign that has featured Russian bombardment and artillery targeting of hospitals, maternity wards, schools, you name it, civilian targets. And that is why you hear President Biden, other Western leaders describe what Putin and Russian forces are doing are crimes against humanity, crimes, war crimes, and why there has been a call for an ICC investigation, International Criminal Court investigation, even though neither the United States nor Russia nor Ukraine is actually a member of the ICC. The ICC is investigating, and rightly so. It's why we've actually seen President Biden describe what's happening as a genocide. It's not a formal declaration on the part of the United States. That will come later. But when you look at the definition as prescribed under the UN, it does seem to meet it, particularly when you look at the Russian actions matched up with the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin and from other sources. So it is the worst global security crisis since World War II. Cuban Missile Crisis was certainly a serious crisis, but this one is global in nature because all of you know it's affecting the price you pay for gas. It's affected food prices. Russia is the leading exporter of wheat in the world. Ukraine is the fifth leading exporter of wheat in the world. So food prices, I hate to tell you, are likely going to continue to go up. Energy prices have sort of stabilized. Russia's the number three producer of energy in the world. So if you're in Africa or Latin America or here in the United States, you are feeling the effects of this. And so this is a global crisis. It is also, I'll stop with this, but I think it's a reminder that the way governments and regimes treat their own people is indicative of how they'll behave in foreign policy. So that when you see Putin trampling the human rights of his own citizens, just this week, a friend of mine, Vladimir Karamoza, who has been to FIU several times, and in fact was supposed to speak, I think, with Martin Polish's class next week, was arrested on Monday, put on trial Tuesday, and sentenced to 15 days in prison. Unfortunately, the expectation is that is a lead up to a longer prison sentence based on spurious criminal charges. You look at what happened to Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition, who was poisoned in Russia by Russian agents And then because he had to be evacuated to Germany for emergency medical treatment, he was then charged with violating his parole. Again, an absurd charge on its face. He has also been tried on additional charges to keep him in prison beyond the 2024 so-called elections in Russia. So this crackdown on human rights in Russia, the last independent radio station has been closed down. The last independent TV station has been closed down. Novaya Gazeta, the last real independent newspaper, has been forced to suspend publication. Its editor-in-chief was just attacked last week by presumably Kremlin goons who were sent after him. No one is safe there. You see Americans. The WNBA star was arrested in February. Americans are not safe being there. And so when a regime like the Putin regime doesn't respect the human rights of its own people, we shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't respect the rights of Ukrainians or Georgians or Belarusians, Moldovans. The list sadly goes on and on, or Syrians. And so you see this projection of a regime's treatment of its own people playing out against other countries, against other populations. And it is why I think what happens in these countries matters. Even a country like Belarus, which has been on the terrible leadership for the past, now coming on 28 years of Alexander Lukashenko, often called the last dictator of Belarus, the worst crackdown on human rights after he stole the election there in 2020. You would think, well, Belarus, a country of 9 million people, no concern of ours. In May of last year, there was a civilian airliner flying from Athens to Vilnius, and it went over Belarus airspace. Belarus agents knew that there was a blogger who was critical of Lukashenko on that flight, and they forced the plane to land in Belarus, endangering in the process all 128 people on board that flight. If they had not landed, they sent up a military jet to force it down. It's possible they would have shot out of the sky. Who knows? They put everyone in danger on that plane. And the next time you're flying over or near Belarus or some comparable country, you might be in danger. I just literally came back from Berlin yesterday. Obviously, I didn't get near Belarus or Russia, but you'd think twice about who might be sitting next to you and where you're flying over. Last summer and spring, Lukashenko weaponized migrants. He literally brought migrants from the Middle East and South Asia and then tried at least to push them across the Belarus border into Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland in particular, causing a massive crisis there. So to think that the developments inside a country don't spill over and have an impact on us is completely wrong. And so it will affect us. And it's why I think what's happening in Ukraine should be of great concern. It's about certainly sovereignty and territorial integrity, but it's about the treatment by some governments toward others that will have an impact on all of us. Sorry for the long answer.
No, no, thank you so much for that not only recap, but additional information. And you really raised a lot of great points that we're going to explore even further in our discussion. One of the things that you raised is the global, right? You mentioned the globe, and that's in fact one of the reasons we wanted to have this particular discussion. How does this relate, if you will, to the global order? Does it challenge the global order? What's happening here? And so let me go with my second question. My second question. Again, I encourage those in the audience to, if you've got any questions you want to chime in, please raise your hand. And again, the same thing for the folks in Zoom. But let me go to my second question, if I can, and that relates to your, again, that globe comment you mentioned, the global. Now, many observers have claimed that the cooperation we have seen across the European continent and across the Atlantic, the U.S. European, if you will, cooperation has been unprecedented. Kind of what we've heard those terms used. So, my first question: what do you believe was most impressive, perhaps even surprising to you, among the various tools, the actions, the policies that the West has employed to punish Russia or to deal with Russia as it relates to its invasion? I'll start with that question, and I'll bring in my second question.
Sure. Well, first, I think the Biden administration, and I've criticized some of its actions and policies related to Russia-Ukraine situation, deserves enormous credit for the coordination with allies and getting this sanctions regime in place and ready to impose as soon as Putin invaded Ukraine. The coordination that Secretary Blinken has done with his European counterparts, and to be clear, it isn't just Europeans. The Japanese have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia. South Korea has. A number, Australia, New Zealand, even, which generally doesn't impose sanctions on anyone, has done so. But there are some disappointments too. India has basically sided with. It's trying to play neutral. It isn't. It's the largest democracy in the world, and I think it is terribly disappointing the principles that it should be standing behind. China, obviously one of the major players in the world, I think has found itself in an awkward situation. It has had a good relationship with Putin. President Xi and President Putin, in fact, met in early February before the invasion happened, the start of the Olympics. It seems pretty clear that President Xi requested that Putin not launch the invasion during the Olympics. By the way, whenever Putin attends Olympics, something bad usually happens. In 2008, he invaded Georgia as the Olympics were happening. He was sitting next to President Bush at the time, and so China is trying to play it both ways a little bit. Doesn't like the sanctions that have been imposed, but it also is afraid of helping Russia defy those sanctions, get around those sanctions, because then it would be in bad standing with the United States. The sanctions that you asked about, these are the largest sanctions against any country imposed in the world. They are unprecedented. They have had an immediate impact in the sense that the ruble plummeted in value the day that they were imposed. Interest rates in Russia soared, and Russians have had great difficulty getting money out of the bank. Now, the ruble has kind of returned to its previous levels, but that's because there has been some adjustment to the sanctions that have been put in place. Russia has been expelled from the SWIFT banking system, although not all Russian banks, and that needs to be done. We've seen Putin himself sanctioned. Not again, you got to, as you underscored in your question, Shlomi. These are international sanctions. These are not American sanctions. The United States obviously is a key part, if not the leading player in this. But this is the international community, for the most part, with some exceptions that I mentioned, imposing these sanctions in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Putin joins very elite company that no one should want to be a part of. I mentioned Lukashenko before. Lukashenko has been sanctioned by the international community. North Korea's Kim, of course, has. The leaders in Iran have. Not sure that's the company you want to keep. And so these sanctions, I think, will continue to have major effect. Most, not all, American and international companies have suspended operations in Russia or are withdrawing completely. That will have a major impact because a lot of Russians work for these companies and they're suddenly going to be unemployed. Putin and his economic team failed to secure their foreign currency reserves. So half of the $630 billion that Russia has in foreign currency reserves are held overseas. All that money has been frozen. And then, of course, we've all seen these images and pictures of oligarchs losing their yachts, yachts being seized left and right, and other properties. This should have happened long before. It shouldn't have taken Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the international community to take these steps, because this dirty money coming from Russian oligarchs, and I want to be clear, it's dirty money coming from Russian oligarchs, not saying all Russian money that comes into our country is dirty, far from it. But this dirty money from Russian oligarchs is corrupting and polluting our own financial systems. It's not the explanation for high prices here in Miami, but they drive up real estate prices. They use our systems, which they badmouth. They accuse us of being a threat to them, while at the same time using our systems to safeguard their own money because they don't trust the system in Russia. They know their assets could be seized like that. So we should have done this long before. Better late than never in this case. But the United States has banned the import of Russian oil, gas, and coal. We have not sanctioned it. And the difference is it means we do not allow that to come into our country, but we are not punishing other countries if they allow the import of Russian oil, gas, and coal. Now, the EU just announced a ban on Russian coal. They have not announced a ban on Russian oil and gas because a lot of European countries are dependent in particular on Russian gas. Russian gas is more done on a bilateral transaction basis. Oil is a global commodity. And so the EU, I would argue, needs to take this step. Joseph Borrell, the main leader of the European Council, recently revealed that the EU has provided, this is about 10 days ago, so the numbers are a little dated, but the EU has provided at that point up to about $1 billion in military assistance to Ukraine, while at the same time it has provided $30 billion to Russia for purchase of Russian oil and gas. And so this remains a major lifeline, if you will, for Putin to provide the necessary revenue to generate his military campaign against Ukraine. So there are more things that can and should be done, but I think also credit for what has been done. There's also the military assistance side, and we can maybe come to that a little later. But that too has been unprecedented. The military assistance that the international community is providing. And again, international community. It's not just the United States.
So let me develop this. And this would be my second question. Do we have some questions on Zoom already? Perfect. Let me go through the second question very, very quickly, and then I'll come to Zoom. And again, I see some hands in the audience. Wonderful. So just building up perhaps on what you just mentioned, and perhaps looking at this more broadly from a more geopolitical viewpoint, right? Because that's again the what we wanted to base our event on, the motivation for this event. What lessons can we draw for European EU transatlantic cooperation? And you're absolutely correct to include, of course, Japan, South Korea. I didn't mention those, but you're absolutely correct. So, what lessons, if you will, from kind of a geopolitical viewpoint, can we draw from, if you will, not only this transatlantic cooperation, but from this international cooperation in comparison, if you will, to say the past few years and decades? Again, we've heard many pundits saying that's been unprecedented as well. What is your view on that?
Yeah, Luis Guillermo Solis and I wrote a piece in the Miami Herald, I think back in February or March, in which we described some outreach from presidents in Latin America toward Putin in the month of February. President of Argentina went to Moscow to meet with Putin. The president of Brazil went to Moscow to meet with Putin. Shame on them, frankly. And it shouldn't have taken the invasion of Ukraine for them to realize that going to Moscow, as Russia had built up a very threatening force along the border with Ukraine, was a really dumb idea. I think we have to recognize that when you deal with regimes and leaders like Putin, you are getting into bed with the devil. And I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but that is essentially what's happening. For a leader like Putin to essentially dismiss as fake news or Ukrainian propaganda or British and American propaganda, these images coming out of Bucha, for him to deny what is happening that we can see with our own eyes, and for the language that he has used that makes him wholly complicit in this, should be a signal to everyone. I was very disappointed that the Chancellor of Austria went to Moscow this week. The first leader to a European leader, at least, to go to Moscow. There have been a number of European leaders who deserve a lot of credit for going to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky under serious risk and danger. The presidents of Poland and the prime ministers and Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, rather, Slovakia, Baltic states all sent representatives recently to meet with Ukrainians to as a signal of solidarity. You got to keep in mind most, not all embassies left Kyiv in the lead up to the war, fear that their embassies would be attacked, and now they're returning. So all of this is a reminder, again, this point that when you deal with leaders who don't respect human rights of their own people, you could wind up in some really bad company. And so you need to be much more mindful of this. For Putin to be sanctioned puts him in this horrible elite company. And you should really think twice. Do you want a picture going viral of you sitting down and talking with Putin, either over a very long table or a short one, or shaking Putin's hand, which is unlikely to do given his phobia about germs. But although he doesn't seem to hesitate with Lukashenko, it's a odd relationship there, because they also reportedly hate each other, but and yet they seem to meet all the time. So it's a reminder that democracies are the best countries to have as partners. Promoting and supporting and advancing democracy and freedom around the world is not just a good thing to do because it's the moral right thing to do. It is in our national interest to do it. We have disagreements with fellow democracies. We don't go to war or have threats from our fellow democracies. And so, the more democracy there is, and democracy is under attack, both from external forces and internal forces. Democracy is under attack, but the more freedom and democracy and liberty there are around the world, the safer we'll be, the less likely there will be military conflict, the more prosperous trade partners we'll have. And so it is not just because it's a good thing to do and you feel right and moral about it. It is in our national interest to do it. And so I think that's why leaders around the world need to understand that. We see, by the way, in a country like Georgia, which has been invaded itself. 20% of Georgian territory is occupied by Russian forces. And the leadership in Georgia has criticized the Ukrainian government, saying they kind of provoked this. Total nonsense. And yet the people of Georgia have shown up by the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of the streets of Tbilisi in showing support and solidarity with Ukraine. So sometimes the leaders can be out of touch with where they should be, and the citizens are a good corrective
I
force.
think your last point about democracies being under attack, you were mentioning democracies make for better friends. This is very much in line. Probably a lot of a few international relations students in the audience, perhaps in Zoom as well. You've all heard, right, the argument that democracies do not go to war with other democracies,
Democratic
right?
peace theory.
The democratic peace theory, exactly. So that's certainly in line, and I think also resonates very, very nicely with kind of our broader theme for today, right? What does this mean for geopolitics as well? What does this mean for the future of the world? What does this mean, if you will, for the future of democracies? So let me turn to the audience. I know that there's a few questions. I'll start with the in-person, and then I'll go Aragorn to you for whatever the first question is for Zoom. So if you please go ahead with your question. I think we have a microphone for you right there.
You can hear me? Yeah. My name is Maria Ramirez. I'm a double major in political science and international relations. And doing my research about this important conflict, I found Johnny Harris. He's a political journalist from Vox News and New York Times. And he, in his last documentary, he explains about the sanctions if he actually are working. And he said that some world leaders are sanctioned the majority of Russian oligarchs, but he also explained how some of these people are finding their way to get money, to not suffer from these sanctions. So even though I completely agree with the sanctions, for you, what will be the next step? Or do you believe it will be another step? And if you believe about military intervention?
Sure. Sanctions work most effectively when they are constantly ramped up. The target of sanctions has to anticipate that he or she will get hit with more sanctions unless he or she changes his or her behavior. And so, when I was in the State Department, I was responsible for the sanctions that were imposed on Belarus and the Lukashenko regime from 2006 to 2008. And our goal was to get 8 people, 8 political prisoners out of jail. And I went to Minsk. My last trip there was in April 2007 to warn the government if they didn't release those political prisoners, the United States, and I hoped the European Union, but the United States on its own, if it had to, would increase sanctions on the regime. They didn't release the political prisoners. We followed through on what I warned. They eventually released the political prisoners. So the key from that is to keep ramping up the sanctions and close loopholes. What I think you were describing are these loopholes that oligarchs think they can get away with. That's why you see them scrambling to try to move their yachts from one location, one area of control to another, because they think if they move it to a place that won't carry out the sanctions, their yachts will be protected. We have to go after all of them. We have to do it quickly, because once you announce that someone's on the sanctions list, that person will then try to secrete their ill-gotten gains elsewhere. So moving quickly and moving in a way that you keep ramping up the pressure is critically important. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, please. I mean, if that's okay.
Sure, follow up.
But we know that China is still close
Yeah.
ally with Russia, and we have not imposed any sanctions against China. And also, the people that are suffering the most are pretty much just citizens. So, for you, what will be like the next step about that?
So
Like,
we have warned China not to help Russia in getting around sanctions. We have not yet imposed secondary sanctions on governments that help Russia skirt around the sanctions. We could, and the Chinese are worried that we will. And there have been extensive conversations at highest levels with the Chinese leaders about this. We have warned them, do not help Putin get around or evade sanctions. But as long your point is right, as long as the Chinese do not impose sanctions themselves, the Russians do have that as an opportunity. That said, a lot of Russians are not comfortable with the idea of relying on the Chinese. There is a long history of distrust between the two countries. There was a border skirmish in 1969, which may seem like a long time ago, but a lot of people on both sides still remember that. And the Chinese, some argue this, but are generally a rising power. Russia is a declining power. And a lot of Russians worry that they would be in a very dependent relationship, increasingly so in light of the isolation from the rest of the international community if they had to turn to Beijing all the time. You also asked about military escalation, I think. uh, we constantly have to be mindful of military escalation. However, we cannot become paralyzed by it. We need to remind Putin that we are as big, if not bigger, nuclear power state as Russia is. And I'm not saying we should threaten use of nuclear weapons, but when Putin does, that's when we should remind him you might want to think twice before you would launch a tactical nuclear weapon. Because the United States is the biggest and greatest military power in the world. And so I think as I started at the beginning of this, we have seriously overestimated Russia's military capability. I think we also overestimate Putin's ability to go completely crazy. I don't want you have to factor it in mind, and if he gets really desperate, who knows what he will do. But there is command and control over nuclear weapons in Russia that I think the generals, for the most part, would ensure is preserved and protected. So we don't have great insight into how that works in Moscow. But Putin's also been scapegoating some of these generals, blaming them for the way things have unfolded. There's some truth to that, but Putin's the one who made the decision to invade. And he's been the one calling the shots. So he's the one who bears responsibility. By the way, there have been a stunning number of generals who have been killed on the battlefield in Ukraine. There was one US general killed in the whole 20-year conflict in Afghanistan, one. The estimates now, there are 9 to 10 Russian generals who have been killed in, less than 2 months. And there are even reports that some of the lower ranking or some of the grunt forces, if you will, on the ground are turning against their commanding officers because they don't know why they're there. They can't believe they don't have fuel for their tanks. They can't believe they don't have food or water or other things. And they're frankly kind of pissed off. And they don't want to be sent out to be killed for a mission they don't understand. And so I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago in Foreign Affairs in which I argue one of our policies should be to encourage defections or desertion in the Russian military. Because at the end of the day, Putin is only as good as the people he has to carry out his orders. And if people refuse to carry out those orders, then he becomes an emperor with no clothes.
Before going to the Zoom for a question, I just want to mention one of the other issues that David raises is Russia as a declining power waging war. Again, for some of you in the audience that are students of international relations theory, this is another very interesting question, right? As Russia is indeed kind of a declining power, what does this mean geopolitically for Russia to wage war? It's another very interesting question. Probably we won't get necessarily to talking about the implications per se today, but nonetheless, I think a very interesting question from geopolitical IR theory perspective, if you will. Aragorn, what is our question from the Zoom audience at Zoom, in Zoom?
Okay, so our first question is from Alexandra Domaskina. How long do you think the heavy military actions will continue for, and why?
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical question, and I don't know the answer to it. That said, I don't know how long Russian forces can sustain this campaign. The Ukrainians are receiving massive assistance from the outside, and that is proven to be decisive. There are also a number of people from the United States and elsewhere who are actually going to Ukraine to fight on behalf of the Ukrainians because they're outraged about what the Russians are doing to Ukraine. Russia has sent 75% of its capable ground forces into battle against Ukraine. That means they don't have a lot left to send in and replenish those forces. They've lost a massive number of tanks, aircraft. The Ukrainian air defense capability has proven to be spectacular in this. Neutering Russia's, what had been assumed, massive advantage through the air, and the Russians haven't been able to do this. And so I think the answer to that question boils down to how long can Putin and the Russian military sustain this? And I try to separate wishful thinking because we all want the suffering of the Ukrainians to end from objective analysis on how long this will go on. Putin, as I've said, doesn't care about the Russians' forces dying. He doesn't clearly care about the Ukrainians dying. In fact, he's trying to create as much suffering as possible through this. But I do wonder how long that can go on. The Ukrainians have just performed so heroically. And the landscape is different in the south and the east from what it was in the north and central part of the country. It's more forested in the center and the north. It's more open. And so the kind of battles that would be engaged are different there. And this comes back to where I started with this answer. The Russians are repositioning a lot of the forces that were in the north and the center part of the country to the south and the east. These are forces who have been battered, who are wondering, why am I going from one miserable place that I was the target of to another place for reasons that they don't understand? So, look, I'll end the answer with this. I think there is now, for the first time, a legitimate reason to have a discussion about could this be the end of Putin? Because he has consolidated control over the 22 years he has been in power, but he has really botched this. There's another word I could use, but I won't. I mean, he has really screwed this up. And yes, there is support in Russia. We don't know how much support. Conducting surveys in Russia in normal times is difficult to do. Conducting a survey now is even harder because a lot of Russians are fearful if they give the wrong. If you come to me and I don't know who you are, you ask me, do you support the war? I'm going to be a little careful of what kind of answer I give because I don't know if you're going to report me. And so the level of support, I think, is much thinner than is commonly perceived. And what we need to do is we, the United States and the international community, need to do a better job of getting messaging to Russians to make it clear to them the reason you're paying a lot more for food, the reason sugar is limited in what you can purchase, is not because of the West, it's because of what Putin has done. And so doing a much more effective job on messaging, I think, is a key part of this. Sorry.
I'm trying to go in the order that the hands were raised. I think, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Kramer. Thank you for coming to FIU today. My name is Emmanuel Boek. I'm an international relations major with a certificate in national security studies. Earlier in the lecture, you did say that you were suggesting the EU takes away their dependency from Russian oil. How would that look? Would they try getting more oil from the OPEC countries, or maybe they would try getting it from Venezuela, which is also under a type of socialist regime right now? Or would they be more so trying to expand on their capabilities in renewable resources? How would that look like?
I would say the answer is in part everything you mentioned with one exception. It's not Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't have the means right now to ramp up production. It is completely spent, and that's thanks to Chavez and Maduro for that, and the sanctions that have been imposed. But it's because of the leaders in Caracas. Um, but it is renewable. It is from other OPEC countries. Although I should also say Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have actually been pretty bad in this whole situation. President Biden has tried to encourage them to ramp up production, and they have resisted. It means more from the United States, and there has been for several years now a push for more LNG exports to Europe. It's expensive, but as a number of Europeans have said, particularly now with winter winding down, they can endure a little pain and discomfort. Easy for me sitting either here in Miami or Dallas, but Europeans can endure a little pain and discomfort while Ukrainians are sacrificing their lives. Ukraine is the front line of Russian aggression, and it seems the least that the Europeans could do is to endure a little hardship when it comes to energy. I think the decision by Chancellor Merkel to shut down nuclear power in Germany was a major mistake. It needs to be revisited. And Norway is a major exporter. Norwegian production can and should increase. When you are dependent on a country with an authoritarian moving toward totalitarian regime, that's not a good place to be. And so some European countries are 100% dependent on Russian gas. I mean, look at what happened in Hungary. Hungary is one of those countries, by the way. Viktor Orban is threatening to break unity on sanctions within the EU. And so the faster the EU and Europeans more broadly can get away from their dependence on Russian energy, the better. And so in part, it relies on all the sources that you mentioned, except for Venezuela. It will also, this is, since we're talking about the global implications, this could also factor into the negotiations with Iran, where Iran is a major producer of energy, but under the sanctions regime has not been able to export oil and gas. It could have a huge impact if it did. And it will be interesting to see what, if any, impact this has on negotiations over the nuclear deal. So far, it has not led to a breakthrough, but that might change. Because understandably, the Biden administration is very sensitive on this issue, with inflation being really the leading issue cited by Americans, and the rise. There was a columnist who wrote this. You can see the price of gas when you're driving along a street. I mean, it's posted in big numbers, so you can see the impact this has had in a very visual way. So, when you go to the grocery store, you think, boy, I just paid a lot more for groceries. But at a gas station, it is so visible. And so there is pressure, and it'll be interesting to see how that.
Before we go to the next one on Zoom, and then we'll go to the audience, I just wanted to mention that I'm on a environmental politics listserv. And after the invasion of Ukraine, folks on the listserv blew up. Europe needs to, now this is the time where Europe needs to go to renewables. Even the nuclear energy came up. People saying no nuclear, but yes renewables. So this is certainly, again, that has to be part of the conversation for Europe that's so dependent on Russian oil. But just when you asked that question, I remember that listserv just blowing up with people going back and forth about this is Europe's chance to really have a even more serious engagement about renewables. Aragorn, what's our next question from folks in Zoom?
I'm going to go ahead and read this question exactly as it appears here. If Zelensky was democratically elected, can you explain the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 to overthrow the previous neutral government? If Ukraine is not a Nazi state, can you explain why the Azaz Battalion, a self-proclaimed Nazi organization, dominated the Ukraine militia, and why members hold positions of power in the government?
Yeah, this seems like it's from a criminal troll, to be perfectly blunt. Let's call a spade a spade. Look, Ukraine voted in democratically a pro-Russian president in 2010. This was Viktor Yanukovych, who was prime minister in 2004, and tried to steal the election then. Ukrainians went out in the streets in what became known as the Maidan protest, the Orange Revolution. and refused to accept that stolen election. Yanukovych agreed they had to rerun the election. Yanukovych lost, but then he did run for president in 2010 and he won. I actually was there to observe both rounds of the election. I was actually in Crimea in January 2010 for the first round. And Yanukovych changed Ukraine's laws. Ukraine had been aspiring to join NATO. Yanukovych said, no, we're a non-aligned state. We will not seek NATO membership. But even Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine at the time, was going to sign agreements with the European Union in 2013. Putin pressured him not to. That's what sparked the Euromaidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, not the United States. Having worked in the US government in 2004 when the first Orange Revolution happened, I can tell you we were not behind it. We weren't behind the second one in 2013, 2014. And questions like that reveal that they deny agency to Ukrainians or to Georgians or Moldovans or Russians even. They refuse to believe that people in these countries on their own have had enough and want to change. It always has to be instigated or fomented by the United States. And that, of course, is patent nonsense. And so Zelensky was elected. I was again in Ukraine for the election with 72% of the vote. It was not against a pro-Russian figure. It was against the incumbent Petro Poroshenko. Ukrainians had had enough of him and they wanted to change. So they rolled the dice and they went with an actor. And to win with 72% of the vote, I don't think anyone questioned the integrity or credibility of that election. We didn't meddle in it. Russians tried to, but failed. And then about the Azov Battalion. Look, the Azov Battalion has been controversial because it's viewed as a nationalist militia. But without the Azov Battalion, Ukrainian defense in 2014 would have been significantly weakened. Why? Because the pro-Russian president Yanukovych, when he was in power, significantly weakened the Ukrainian military. And so it meant that these citizens gathered to help defend their country against the first Russian invasion in 2014. And the Azov Battalion, for any controversy that might accompany it, are giving up their lives, sacrificing to defend their country in Mariupol. In fact, they have criticized President Zelensky for not providing enough support for them as they're defending Mariupol, which has come under terrible bombardment. So the question, I think, sounds like one that may have come from Moscow or somebody close to
Let me, if I could go back to the.
Well, it's not over yet, so.
Let me go to our in-person audience, please. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for being here and sharing this insight with us, members of the FI community. I'm Ross here, a sophomore in international business, and I just want to say, first of all, I have to admire those socks. They are incredible socks from the beginning. I saw these. That certainly brightens up the mood.
I was hoping nobody would notice, but that didn't work anyway.
Now, for my serious question, you had mentioned earlier how democracies have united and worked together in an unprecedented way to stop this or to prevent Russia from escalating sanctions and all that. And we did talk about China earlier and why they have been reluctant to both side questions or side with the West. And I believe that that's what a lot of Americans personally know. But where I'm confused is with India. As you mentioned, it's the largest democracy in the world. And it's a bit unclear why they have still stayed sort of neutral and playing both sides. And then the follow-up question would be, what can we do to bring them into this alliance that we have against Russia?
Great, thank you. And I should also point out, since I haven't traveled overseas and I left Dallas Tuesday to go to Berlin, I'm a little out of practice in packing and I forgot to pack shoes. So that's why I'm also. But
You pull it off perfect.
yeah, well, clearly no one noticed.
As long as it works.
Exactly. India has had a complicated relationship with Russia for many, many years. And it has a very complicated relationship with China as well. And India is trying to find the right balance in this. Prime Minister Modi is not exactly the staunch advocate of democracy. There were questions, for example, about whether to invite India to the Summit for Democracy, given some of the actions and behavior of the Modi government, um, uh, particularly to the Muslim population in India. And India has actually increased its import of Russian energy since Russia's invasion, and has also been purchasing significant arms from Russia, which is kind of ironic because the Chinese have increased their purchases of Russian arms for a number of years, not just since the invasion. And President Biden did have a long conversation with Prime Minister Modi, I think it was earlier this week, and I don't think he got anywhere. Modi is trying to sort of straddle the fence, if you will, and I think that is, yeah, a borderline immoral position to take. It's an irresponsible position to take. India should be, again, as the largest democracy, right there with the United States and other democracies around the world in condemning the invasion, and supporting the Ukrainian people who are trying to defend their land and their freedom. India has abstained UN General Assembly rather than vote for an earlier resolution condemning Russia's invasion. And that's not a position India should be in my view. So it is with great regret and anger, even I would say, that India has taken the positions that it has. It should do it. It can and should do better. And to me, there's no fence to straddle in this. This is about as black and white as it comes. Um, I- Ukraine is the innocent victim of Putin's aggression, Putin's invasion. Putin and I don't mean to assign blame to the entire country, but and Russia, the guilty parties here. It's not more complicated than that. And for India not to know the difference is kind of a shame.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
We'll go to Zoom, and then we'll come back to in-person audience.
Okay, our next question is from Galina Bogatova. What do you think would be the best instrument against Russian internal and external propaganda? Do you think the US should collaborate with the exiled political dissidents, journalists, and representatives of the opposition who fight the regime?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer, Galina, I think you said the short answer, Galina, to your question is yes, that we should be working with particularly Russians who have been forced to flee the country out of political fear, fear of being persecuted. Many had to leave before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is not a new phenomenon, though it's significantly accelerated since events of February 24th. The best people to reach inside Russia with accurate news and information are Russians themselves. It will be more credible if it's Russians hearing from Russians about what's really happening than if it's, no disrespect to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which has done, I think, a tremendous job under tremendously difficult circumstances. And the president of it is a good friend of mine, but it is much better if they're hearing it from, so, and RFERL, by the way, employs a number of Russians. And so actually that is an effective way to do it. Yeah, we have to be careful, and it's why I had that hesitation at the end to your question about India and Russia. We have to be a little careful about painting with too broad a brush, and trying to blame every Russian for what Putin has done. There are a lot of Russians, including in this community, who oppose it, condemn it, are disgusted by what Putin has done, and we should embrace them and work with them. For those Russians who side with Putin, I actually do favor ostracizing them. I think we are at this kind of hinge pivotal moment. And so I don't have any patience for people who would defend or justify what's happening, but I have enormous, almost endless patience for Russians who oppose what Putin is doing, not just now with the invasion of Ukraine, but what he has been doing over the 2+ decades that he's been in power. Some of my closest friends are Russians who are not fans of Mr. Putin. Vladimir Karamoza, I mentioned before, who's been here, is a very good friend of mine. I'm deeply worried about his welfare now that he's in a Russian prison. And it's Kara and others like him who actually have a hell of a lot more courage than I do, who actually go to Russia and speak out against their government, against grave risk. And so I want to work with them. I want to embrace them. I don't want them to feel that they are being uh, uh, painted with the same brush, if you will.
Let me go back to the audience. I know that we've got a few questions. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. We'll get to all the questions.
Hi, my name's Alexa Ramon Frost. I'm a graduate student in the International Studies program. I was wondering, just because I've heard a lot of people talking about this, like as this war has kind of gone on, and like through the inaction of the international community to like militarily get involved, um, people have been talking about China doing like launching a similar offensive with Taiwan. How much stock do you place in these concerns?
Yeah, it's a very good question because I think the international reaction to what Putin has done has implications for what other governments might be thinking, and in particular to the case that you cited, which is President Xi's thinking toward Taiwan. And if I were President Xi, I would think twice about before launching a military campaign against Taiwan. He may think we're distracted, and there's probably an element of truth to that. Putin thought we were distracted with COVID and our own domestic problems and so on, and that proved to be a disastrous miscalculation on Putin's part. So my assumption is that in Beijing, Chinese leaders are thinking twice before they might do anything militarily toward Taiwan. I mentioned earlier at the outset, Shlomi, when you asked me the first question, there have been parts of the Biden administration's policy that I've been critical of. And I think one of them was for President Biden and his administration to repeatedly and publicly say what we won't do, which is we won't put US forces on the ground. I'm not saying that position is wrong. I'm saying it over and over is a bad idea. Don't telegraph to your enemy what your limitations are. We've had a policy of strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan, but and we recognize a one China policy, but at the same time, Taiwan is a leading democracy. And that is one of the many differences between Taiwan and China. But I think we have also been fairly clear, despite that strategic ambiguity, that we will come to the defense of Taiwan should China attack it. And surveys in the United States have shown Americans actually support that. So I do think that Beijing is watching this, Tehran is watching this, bad guys everywhere are watching how the international community responds to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and it's why I'm rather heartened by the response so far, despite some of the criticism, part of which I just voiced. That I think we are sending a good signal around the world. And President Biden's trip to Poland when he was in Europe recently, in which again, this is where I think saying something repeatedly was the right thing to do, in which he said, "We hold NATO territory as sacrosanct. We will defend every inch of NATO territory." Because there you do not want Putin to think he can get away with an attack. There's only been one time where Russia launched an effort against a NATO ally. It was 2007 against Estonia with a massive cyber attack. He has not done it since. I do think Putin takes Article 5 security guarantees, which treat an attack on one NATO ally as an attack against all. It was only invoked once in 2001 and after 9/11. But I do think Putin does actually respect Article 5 security guarantees, and I want him to continue to do so. And I want President Xi to think that we will also stand by Taiwan if he were to do anything.
I think your question also gets very nicely at the theme
Yeah.
of today's talk because, as you mentioned, David, other countries are watching. How is the world reacting? How is is the Russian invasion successful or not? Right? Those are all kind of broad, uh, 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 with a lot of geopolitical implications to to those phenomena. So, thank you for that question. Let's go back to the Zoom if we have another question.
Our next question is from Matthew Gomez. While Macron is likely to win the French presidential runoff,
Hope.
What do you see might happen if Le Pen wins concerning the global order and the Ukrainian issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, it's a little heartening that Macron came out on top in the first round. This is a repeat of what happened the last time. And I am cautiously optimistic that Macron will pull this out. I think Mélenchon will encourage his supporters, or at least not to vote for her, even if he doesn't say vote for Macron. There is a lot at stake in this. If she were to win, it would mean the end of EU unity on sanctions. I mean, you already have the problem with Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party winning re-election, essentially. Questions about whether Orban will break EU unity on sanctions. But if she were to win, all bets are off. Let's remember that in the last election, she openly took $10 million from the Russians. Let me say it again, she openly took $10 million from the Russians. That's the kind of president France would have if she were to win. It would be open and massive corruption in France. She would be bought and paid for by the Kremlin. And so I hope French voters, when they go, I guess, in 2 weeks, will realize what's at stake. They did the last time, and I'm cautiously confident they will again.
I know that there were a few questions from the audience. Would you like to go ahead?
Earlier this week, in a joint statement, Sanna Marin of Finland and Magdalena Andersson of Sweden have intimated that the decision to join NATO is perhaps weeks away, not months away. What is the likelihood of Sweden and Finland breaking their historic neutrality and joining NATO? And what can Putin do? Will he try to hurt those two countries in some way?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, Shlomi, it comes to the geopolitics of this.
You're sticking to the theme. I love it.
Exactly. Pedro, Putin is actually seeing the very scenario he thought he was preventing come to fruition. He has seen Ukraine unite. Zelensky's numbers, by the way, before Russia's invasion, he won with 72% of the vote in 2019. He was in the 20s in surveys, in some surveys. He's now again conducting surveys in Ukraine as challenging in a war, but upwards of 90% support the way he's led this campaign. So he's united Ukrainians. Failure number one on Putin's part. He is now producing the very scenario that you described, which is Finland and Sweden. Finland more so than Sweden, but I think Sweden won't be far behind. They don't want to be left out. Are looking seriously at joining the alliance, and there's nothing Putin can do, in my view. He's not, I don't think, going to launch a military campaign against Finland to try to prevent it from joining. That didn't work too well in the Finnish war in 1940. And he's so bogged down in Ukraine right now that he can't afford to go somewhere else. Not to minimize the threat Russia poses elsewhere, but he has turned Finns and Swedes and everyone else against him. I mean, he is truly a pariah, an isolated pariah, and has turned people in other countries against him and against Russia. He's done this with Ukrainians before in 2014 when he invaded the first time. He's done it with Georgians when he invaded. Generally, people don't like to be invaded. And when you do, the attitude toward the invader is not very positive. I mean, we've sort of seen this a little bit ourselves, not to make moral equivalence arguments here. But so yeah, it looks like, I think by the end of the summer, possibly, NATO will enlarge from 30 to 32 members. There's a deeper issue, though, too, which is Ukrainians' attitude toward NATO. Zelensky feels disappointed in and frustrated with NATO. And that is why he has proposed neutrality in negotiations with the Russians. By the way, for those who have argued that NATO is the reason Putin invaded, NATO enlargement, well, Ukraine has offered to be neutral, and that has not stopped the Russian campaign. I've never bought into this argument. that it's NATO enlargement that is the cause of this. And again, it denies agency to countries that aspire to join. NATO enlargement is driven by a demand process, including when in 1999, when the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined. Had it not been for Václav Havel and Lech Walesa pushing for membership, we would not have enlarged the alliance in the 1990s or in the subsequent decade. And so we now are looking at a situation where Finland and Sweden want Article 5 security guarantees because they are deeply worried about what Putin might do. And again, it comes back to your question about when I talked about Article 5, they think Putin actually does respect Article 5 and they want that protection.
We'll take one more question from Zoom. I know we have at least two questions here in the audience. Please, Aragorn.
We have a question from Sergei Podlesnik. As a Russian person, I see growing support of Putin and the regime in general from the grassroots. Rally around the flag, described by John Mueller, is relevant as ever. What is the path forward? How do we amend the relations with the brainwashed, nationalist, warmongering state, even if Putin is removed?
Yeah, Sergei gets at a key issue, who was it? Was it Timothy Snyder, I think, recently wrote a piece that Putin is not just destroying Ukraine, he's destroying Russia. And it will take a long time for Russians to get over this. It is hard, I think, for a lot of Russians to believe that their leader has made such a catastrophic decision. And one thing when I get asked this question, I go back to 1999 when Putin first came to power. In September 19, Putin becomes prime minister in August 1999. In September 1999, there were 4 explosions in buildings, 2 in Moscow and 2 elsewhere in Russia, that killed 300 people. They're incredibly suspicious. And the suspicion is that actually it was not Chechen terrorists, as the official government line was. It was actually elements of the FSB, which is the successor agency of the KGB, in support of Putin to turn the political situation in Russia upside down in order to open the door for Putin to go in and become president. And most Russians don't like to talk about 1999 because to consider the possibility that their own government would kill 300 of their own people for simply political reasons is almost too much to stomach. And so I think for a lot of Russians, they don't want to believe what they're hearing from outside of Russia. So they buy into the Kremlin propaganda. It will take a long time to get people to understand what they've been hearing and relentlessly pummeled into them is completely fabricated, is completely wrong. But I'm also not sure how sustainable this is. Is the sanctions continue to have an impact as they kick in, and most Russians' lives are immiserated, and even if they don't bring the body bags back to Russia, families realize their sons, their husbands, their fathers are not coming home. That too, I think, is going to have an impact. And Putin has always been worried about the body bag effect. It's why last year the Russian parliament actually passed legislation creating mobile crematoria. It's rather a ghastly thing to think about, but it's essentially to hide the evidence. Now, tragically, it's also been used to hide the evidence of atrocities committed in parts of Ukraine by Russian forces. But this is an indication of nervousness on the part of the leadership in Moscow that they are worried about the blowback from Russian society.
We'll go here, then we'll go to Zoom, and then we'll go to you for the last question. We'll close up the event.
We have rather stunning events that we see every day. Most recently, we've got the flagship missile cruiser, the Moskva, foundering and then sinking under tow. Russia has lost more men now in the last 2.5 months as they did in Afghanistan for the 10 years of that war, which contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. If, as Kara Mursa and David Kramer were alluding to today, There's Ukraine's the bête noire of Putin. How do you see the West coming to the aid of a rudderless Russia to ensure that democracy?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. It's the sinking of that flagship, by the way, was pretty amazing. And here too, Kremlin propaganda saying it was a fire on board that caused it. Ukrainians fired missiles and sunk it. And it shows both Ukrainian capabilities and Russian incompetence. They would leave a ship like that vulnerable and can't even tell the truth about it. It all depends on how the regime ends, to answer your question. I don't think, I don't rule out entirely, I don't think there would be a popular revolution that would produce regime change. There are huge risks for people to go out and protest right now. I actually think if the regime comes to an end, it will be because the circle around Putin will have decided he is taking us over a cliff. And whether that's the military or others or the FSB, a lot of these people are close to Putin. It won't be the oligarchs. The oligarchs, for the most part, are gutless. They will issue statements expressing regret about the war, but if you look at almost all of them, none of them condemn Putin for the decision to invade. They try to stay in his good graces while at the same time trying to protect their assets in the West. I think it will come from people inside. There were rumors that Minister of Defense Shoigu has had a heart attack and is hospitalized. One of the top members of the FSB, in charge of foreign intelligence, reportedly has been placed under house arrest. The deputy of the National Guard apparently has resigned, although it's not clear whether that happened before the invasion. There's stuff happening. It's like Churchill said, it's like bulldogs under a carpet fighting. And there's clearly something going on. But our insight, despite the gathering of US intelligence on what's been happening in Russia, which has been rather extraordinary, our insight into these kinds of politics is very limited. I'm not predicting the end of the regime, but I think for the first time you can actually talk about the possibility of it. And that is different, and that's all because of the decision Putin made. Had he not invaded Ukraine, he could have painted any of this as a victory. I don't see how he paints. Putin, in my view, cannot win now, despite efforts that Kremlin propaganda would put forward. I can't see how he loses this really, really bad. And then the other part, of course, is at what cost does this come in Ukrainian lives? That's the tragedy of this.
Take a question from Zoom, and then we'll have our last question, and then we'll close up.
Okay, I hope I'm not butchering this name, but it comes from Michael Aboagie. Though we've said and repeated many times that we won't send American soldiers to fight in Ukraine, do you think there'd be a change in policy if Russia uses chemical, biological weapons, or even nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that we would put forces on the ground, but I think we would likely ramp up our air campaign. I think this would put added pressure for a no-fly zone, which is a controversial issue. I understand that. But if any of those were to be used, it would really challenge us with the refrain "never again." And I think there would be growing pressure and outrage for us to do more than we have. And we've done a lot, to be fair, but not enough, clearly. But if any of those things were done, I just wonder, there is a risk that we become numb to this. We've seen what Putin has done to his own people in Chechnya in '99. We've seen what he's done in Syria in 2015, 16 with Aleppo. What we're seeing play out in Ukraine is not out of character for Putin. That's an important thing to take away from this. This is not unusual for him. And so we didn't do anything in Syria. We drew a red line and then we erased it. We haven't drawn a red line on what Putin could do to Ukraine. We've drawn one when it comes to NATO. But I am certain in talking to people in Washington that the administration has thought through what kind of response it would have if he were to use any of these weapons. The main thing is to try to deter him from doing it.
We'll take our last question from the audience, the in-person.
Thank you. My name is Jared Violetis. I'm a public administration and policy student. You kind of answered my question with the chemical one, but here I have the second question. Before the invasion, Russia sent a very ridiculous list of demands, one of them being that Ukraine not join NATO. And now we're seeing possibilities of, of Ukraine being neutral. What would a neutral Ukraine look like right now? Would they give up regions of the southeast? Would Donetsk be annexed like Crimea was in 2014?
Yeah, and another great question, by the way. Great questions from everyone. Well, except for that one. Although I'm glad, Aragon, you read it because actually it's important to air it out. No, absolutely. I'm glad you did it. Yep. I have no doubt. That's why I don't do social media. Um, um, I think neutrality is not what President Zelensky wants, but just as importantly, it's not what the Ukrainian people want. Last year, President Zelensky devoted most of his foreign policy efforts to trying to get an answer of yes to his interest in pursuing NATO membership. And he didn't get anywhere, by the way. This is another example of how Putin doesn't understand the countries closest to him. He has terrible understanding of Ukraine. And he either mistakenly thought or decided he would just fabricate the reason that Ukraine was moving toward NATO membership. It's not. In 2008, NATO issued a communique in which it said Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. Didn't say how, it didn't say when. And there hasn't been a great deal of progress with either country, Ukraine or Georgia, much to the frustration of both countries. And so Zelensky, having campaigned and lobbied actively last year for NATO membership, now, I mentioned before, he's disappointed and frustrated with NATO and its response. He doesn't feel NATO is providing enough assistance to Ukraine. That's why he's presented it. And he thought he would at least respond to those who say, well, if you offered to be neutral, then Putin would stop his invasion. Well, that's proven to be completely wrong. He did offer neutrality, and Putin has kept up the campaign. So he has said if there were a negotiation, it reached agreement in which Ukraine would be a neutral state, two things would have to happen. Security guarantees, legal security guarantees from other members of the international community. He has said Russia because he has to in order to get buy-in on this, but in particular, most importantly, from the United States. And I don't think the Biden administration has decided on whether it would be willing to offer those kinds of security guarantees to a neutral non-NATO state. The other part of it is he has made clear that any decision about Ukrainian neutrality would have to be put forward in a referendum to the Ukrainian voters. And I would bet you everything that Ukrainian voters would not support that referendum. I mentioned before, in 2010, the pro-Russian president Yanukovych changed Ukrainian foreign policy and said Ukraine is a non-aligned state. It was a non-aligned state in 2014 when Putin invaded. It wasn't NATO that was the reason Putin invaded in 2014. It wasn't the reason he invaded this year either. And so Zelensky, I think, realizes that a referendum would reject it. But look, he's also under tremendous pressure to stop the bleeding, literally and figuratively. And you know, if you saw the image of him when he went to Bucha to see what had happened there, I talk about a picture worth 1,000 words. That the pain on his face, and you see it not just then, but constantly, and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And so he's got these competing demands to end the suffering, to end the bloodshed, with a a party on the other side that shows no interest in doing so. In looking at this as possibly the opportunity to deal Putin a huge blow and regain territory they lost 8 years ago. And so those two don't go together. But it is why you hear Ukrainians keep asking for military assistance, because I think for the most part, they want to keep pushing. They see an opportunity here. The last thing we should do is pressure Zelensky to negotiate a ceasefire. If that's what he wants to do, we should get behind him 100%. That's his decision. After all, it's Ukrainians who are fighting and dying here, not us. But if Zelensky wants to continue the campaign, it seems to me the least we can and should do is to provide him the military means to accomplish the goal. And the last thing I'll say, I do think we have to change our way of thinking and see this as an opportunity to deliver a huge, possibly fatal blow to Putin, to Putinism, and to authoritarianism around the world. There aren't going to be many other opportunities like this. We better hope not, because this is a incredibly costly one. But given the sacrifices so many Ukrainians have made already, this is an opportunity to make sure this never happens again, at least with Mr. Putin in power, and possibly to see him no longer in power.
So I wanna just throw in a very, very quick question to you. I know that you obviously teach in the Global Affairs program. And one
Last
of your-
class tomorrow.
That's
why
right.
I'm here
That's
today.
right. Your last class tomorrow. And I know that one of the assignments that you offer your students, or that you request of your students, is a memo where the students have to provide some policy recommendations. Well, I want to turn the tables a little bit if I can, right? If I was a student, and ask you, and you may be doing this already, but if you were advising Biden right now, and you've already told us kind of what you would be recommending, what you would be suggesting. So you've already, I think, answered some of that parts of that question. But what would you be telling Biden? What should the United States be doing right now as it relates to this particular war?
A couple things. One is be driven by Zelensky. As I said, Ukrainians are fighting and dying in this war. We have to follow their lead. Doesn't mean we follow every single thing up to every detail. There will be some differences, undoubtedly. But Zelensky is the one who really should be calling the shots here. So no pressure on him for a ceasefire. To provide whatever military assistance we can to help them win. Avoid these public disputes that we've seen between state and the Pentagon over these MiG fighters in Poland. If they need planes, send them planes. If they need Patriot missiles, send them Patriot missiles. This is a fight that matters enormously for us, and it is not being fought by us, being fought by them. What they're asking for are the military means to defend their country. Third, continue the buildup of NATO and US presence in the countries that border Ukraine and Russia, so that Putin doesn't get any crazy ideas, whether it's with NATO or non-NATO member states. Fourth, keep ramping up the sanctions. And close loopholes, sanction, not just ban the import of, sanction the Russian energy industry. And if that forces the Europeans' hands, so be it. Fifth, get a Marshall-like plan ready for Ukraine to help rebuild. That is going to be critical, but the onus for paying that should come from the Russians, not from us. I'm of the view, and I was at this conference I attended in Berlin, this issue came up, and I was in discussion with some people. I actually think not only should we freeze these assets, we should seize these assets and then put them to use to help Ukraine recover. And then last thing is, don't close the door on every Russian. There are many, many, many good Russians out there, and who are disgusted by what's happening, and keep the door open to them, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the future of that country. And so we will want to keep open the door for good relations, not as long as Putin is in power. I've never felt that was possible. The book you mentioned that I wrote in 2017, I argued it wasn't possible. But I also don't think countries are doomed forever to live under authoritarian regimes. I think, as President Bush, whose institute I now work at, I work for him in the State Department, believe that if given the opportunity, every person wants to live in freedom. And so try to find ways to give people the opportunity to do so. And as we've discussed already with the democratic peace theory, if Russia can move at least in a more democratic direction, we'll have fewer problems with it, and that'll be good for everybody.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone, the audience that here is with us in person. I want to thank the audience that's with us on Zoom. I want to thank you, David Kramer, for a wonderful conversation and certainly some amazing questions from the audience as well. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and Slava Ukraina.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.